Portland Institute for Psychedelic Science. Dr. Louma just completed up a clinical trial on MDMA-assisted therapy for social anxiety disorder, which he will share about today in his talk named From Pilot to Protocol, Psychotherapy in MDMA-assisted therapy for social anxiety disorder. Welcome to the stage, Dr. Jason Louma.
We actually don't have the clicker.
I'll go ahead.
Does anybody have a remote? If anybody can bring me a remote, that would be great. Thank you. So I'm here to talk about the process by which we developed the psychotherapy component of our trial in our clinical trial of MDMA-assisted therapy for social anxiety disorder. And I just wanted, the trial was run through our Portland Institute for Psychedelic Science, where we run clinical trials that are largely self-funded through the clinical services that we provide, and the profits from those, rather than going into the pockets of the owners, go to fund the clinical trials. And so we also provide psychedelic-assisted therapy, and we do some training as well. So just to give you a little sense of the context where this trial was run. This is our research team, fantastic group of folks, and this was very much a team effort. All of this development, all the work, and just so much thanks to this group. So MDMA-assisted therapy shows promise for social anxiety disorder. There was a prior trial by Alicia Danforth as the first author, and but there hasn't been disorder-specific psychotherapy protocols created. And this is also just generally true of psychedelic-assisted therapy, that often, or most of the time, the psychotherapy protocols are either these kind of relatively general psychedelic-informed therapy protocols like developed by MAPS, or they take standardized non-psychedelic therapy approaches like CBT or motivational enhancement therapy, and they put it together with the psychedelic, but there's relatively minimal adaptation. And so there's an opportunity here for us to integrate evidence-based treatment principles and with the unique psychopharmacological effects of MDMA, and through theory-driven kind of optimization, potentially result in psychotherapy protocols that kind of result in a larger effect overall if we go through this process. So our clinical trial was really organized around the idea that by the end of the clinical trial, we wanted to have a really well-adapted psychotherapy protocol that was optimized for MDMA and optimized for social anxiety disorder. And so this is the process that we use, and we kind of recommend other psychotherapy developers in this space consider using. So it starts with a literature review. You go into the literature, you review what we know about the drug or the substance that you're studying, how it works. You review the disorder or the condition that you're targeting, and the psychotherapeutic mechanisms that tend to be effective for that. And you put those together in a conceptual synthesis. And ideally you write that up formally and publish that before you run your trial. And then based on that, you start developing a treatment manual. And this is the kind of looping part of this. So you develop the treatment manual, you test it with some of the participants in the trial, you systematically observe how it's working, and then you make revisions based on those observations and based on the theory and the literature that you've reviewed, and you keep iterating that, revising the protocol, testing it, revising the protocol, testing it, until basically you run out of participants in the trial. And at that point, you look at the outcome, and hopefully you have measured processes of change throughout. And so you have a sense of, are the processes that we think we're targeting responding to the intervention? And you have that data at the end to then have your manual, have some data on it, and then go on to your next clinical trial with an optimized psychotherapy component. So we started off with this lit review as step one, reviewed the basic science on MDMA, but we know that basic science, it lacks the social context of the clinical research. And if there's anything we know about these psychedelics, including MDMA, is that the context of administration matters a lot to how they affect people. And so this basic research has somewhat limited ability to generalize to the clinical situation. So we also need direct research on mechanisms in the clinical context. And to date, there's really very few studies on this. There may be one more at this point, but as you can see, there were maybe two that existed when we started the trial. So we had really limited data to support our conceptualizations. But we wrote these up in a couple papers, and then we proceeded with the trial. This is the basic model that we came up with of key variables that we thought might be impacted by MDMA-assisted therapy in the context of social anxiety disorder. And in the trial, we're measuring all of these, and we're working on writing up the data right now on how these are changing in the intervention. So what was the study? It was a open label study. It was a randomized controlled trial with a waitlist control. The people with the wait list eventually proceeded to get the treatment. So everybody got the treatment by the end of the study. And we engaged throughout it in an iterative process that I outlined earlier of this protocol development. So we started with the MAPS approach, because this was the established approach at the time. And that seemed like the responsible place to start. And so we were trained in it. We were certified and supervised by the MAPS-approved consultants. And so as far as MAPS, or Lykos thought, we were doing this by the book, and we were doing it competently. So after the first 6 participants went through the study, we stopped. We paused for a little while. We reviewed all of our data. We reviewed the clinical cases, the supervision. We thought about our theory, and we revamped the treatment model, and we started to develop a more targeted, evidence-based, kind of process-focused treatment manual based out of the theory that we brought to it and what we've been observing. And then for the next 14 participants, we continued to iterate that model. So we implemented, reviewed, iterated, and then by the end of the trial came up with a kind of what we think is a fairly complete treatment protocol. So as we did this, I just want to point out a few principles I think are worth considering in the PAT space if you're thinking about how do you develop good psychotherapy. And the first principle is I would call substance therapy synergy. And this is basically the idea that we want to develop interventions that leverage drug effects. We don't want to have just the drug effect plus the psychotherapy. We want to have psychotherapies that pay attention to what the drug does, the substance does, and that it maximize the benefit of the substance, and then conversely the same way. So you get an interaction, not just an additive effect. The second one is what we call context optimization. And that's the idea that set and setting are active therapeutic components, and you want to match what you do to the substance and to the condition, so that not every substance and not every condition should get the same kind of preparation and treatment during the dosing. They should be matched to those contexts. And then the third one is what we call process matching. And this is basically the idea that the intervention should be connected to the current drug state and possible neuroplastic effects. So you might do different things early in the session, say the dosing session, versus later in the dosing session, depending on where they are in the arc of the journey. And so we tried to consider all of these as we were developing this process-based intervention. So as I said earlier, we started out with this non-directive approach from Lykos, and we immediately started to see some problems with the way the participants engaged with this. The first thing was that they tended to avoid material related to social anxiety disorder. And they also tended to focus more on close relationships rather than these performance type situations like I'm doing right now that are more characteristic of social anxiety disorder. We also saw that folks often withdrew from social contact during the MDMA sessions. Many of them would spend most or all of the session inside, eye masks on, and even with repeated prompting and kind of gentle requests in the way we were trained to ask people to take their mask off, people would refuse. And so there's this kind of ongoing avoidance going on during the medicine sessions. And what we also observed after these first 6 cases, that despite people reporting profound MDMA experiences, we were seeing relatively limited translation to lasting change in their actual SAD symptomatology. So this is the point where we started to apply our theory and take what we had seen and try to develop a more targeted intervention, more adapted intervention. And so we got to talk a little bit about theory. And so the first thing to know about social anxiety disorder is what's the core fear? Well, the core fear is that if I reveal certain aspects of myself, I'll be ostracized, I'll be judged, I'll be rejected. That's the core fear. And so the cues are revealing, kind of being authentic, essentially, is the cue for the fear. And the expectancy is rejection, ostracism, and these kinds of things. And so based out of this kind of idea, we identified 3 core mechanisms. There are other ones, but these are the core ones that we identified. So the first was we want to maximize expectancy violations in order to trigger memory reconsolidation. So, and part of the idea is that MDMA may help with that, because when you take MDMA, you tend to find it easy to be authentic. So if you're finding it easy to be authentic, then you're going to trigger the fear cue a lot. That then can allow memory reconsolidation. And the second part of memory consolidation is you need to have something happen that's different than the expectancy. And the self-transcendent and safeness-related emotions that are evoked by MDMA will tend to lead to that. At least this is the idea. So instead, you're authentic, and instead of experiencing fear, instead of experiencing rejection, you have this visceral sense of being safe, this visceral sense of maybe even being loved or lovable in that moment, and that triggers a violation of the expectancy, which can update fears. Then the third thing we were targeting was social reward enhancement. So a number of you probably know about the research with Goldolan on these kinds of ideas with rodents, and it's this idea that for a period of time after the MDMA administration, that people may essentially get more out of social situations. They find social situations more reinforcing. And so we wanted to design integration activities that took advantage of that during that period. It's hard to know how long it is. We don't have data, but the idea is to try to take advantage of that. So we ended up having 4 key intervention protocol components that we developed, and I'm going to unpack each of these over the next few minutes. So the first component we call memory is a combination of memory reprocessing and social experiments. So this is you can think of it as like a kind of exposure during the medicine sessions. So we allowed them to have about 3 hours of non-directive time to be in the space, be in the MDMA without any intervention, to let it kind of build to its fullness of the safeness and the compassion and things like that that can emerge. And then after that point, we started to bring in intentional shame memory reprocessing. So the same thing you would do with PTSD in many ways, but focused on the kinds of traumatic type memories that happen with social anxiety. Then we also include what we call authenticity experiments, which are these in vivo practices where people engage in activities that they feel like are authentic to them, but are hard to do for them in social situations, so that they can experience that under the effects of the MDMA. So that was the first kind of intervention component that we added. The second one was guidance for the therapist on how to be with the person. And the idea is that, again, these are meant to foster these strategic expectancy violations. And, most therapy, you're going to be relatively low levels of self-disclosure and a more neutral therapeutic stance. But what we did here is we provided specific instructions about how to have therapists express care and warmth following client authenticity. If you've ever been around someone on MDMA, you've experienced probably, even if you're not on MDMA, you've experienced that it's easy to feel warm and positive towards that person because they're beaming so much warmth at you often. And so you have this visceral response that if you kind of can utilize that within the moment self-disclosure, it can create this visceral sense of safety that you can amplify through this directed kind of in the moment self-disclosure by the therapist, and that can enhance these expectancy violations, again, that we're trying to foster. The third idea is based around this kind of idea of leveraging these neuroplastic windows during integration. And it focused on essentially homework assignments that people would do between sessions. So we called this social insight applications. People would have these ideas about what they needed to do, and we'd support them in getting active on those and going out into social situations, engaging in authentic behavior versus kind of a more performative, safe, kind of behavior with safety behaviors. And noticing the expectancy violations that occur. So this is different than your typical exposure hierarchy, and it focuses more on positive reinforcement and reward and on these expectancy violations rather than the kind of like fear structures that we're normally trying to target. Then the fourth major component was something we called an empathic reimagining task. And essentially, this is focused on reconsolidating core shame memories, which are thought to be central to how social anxiety sort of functions. And essentially what happens is we do this in each integration session. They recall a shame-triggering scene. They viscerally experience the emotions that are part of that, the shame, the rejection. And then we have them shift to imagining they're in the MDMA session. They contact what we call a touchstone moment, a moment of compassion or love or safeness. And then they kind of have an imagined interaction with the person in that shame scene, and they kind of process that through together. And again, the idea is to create more expectancy violations. In the original scene, the person is rejected, and in the new scene, they are taken care of by this perspective that's kind of filled with some of the emotions that are prominent often in the MDMA session. And we can get some of the kind of a changed understanding of the scene. So just to kind of review what we did, we started off with the first 6 sessions using the MAPS non-directive approach. We saw effect sizes there similar to CBT, so they were decent with that, but not better, which you kind of need to justify including MDMA. And then we engaged in this systematic review, created a new treatment manual, and through the next 14 sessions, we continued to revise that treatment manual. So first off, I just want to show you the overall findings of the study. So this is the MDMA-assisted therapy condition compared to the wait list. And this is the primary outcome, it's the LSAS. And what you see is that we had overall a very large effect size. CBT, psychopharms, usually 1 or less. And so overall, we did see a big effect. When we look at the responder analyses, again, comparing the MDMA to the wait list, you see 80% response, 55% losing diagnosis, 25% remission. One thing to note on this is that almost all of the non-responders were those first 6 cases with the non-directive approach. So once we started using the process-based approach, we saw that almost everybody responded to treatment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but basically these are some data about the different processes that we tried to measure. You see the disability, that's not a process, but acceptance went up in the MDMA group. Shame went down in the MDMA group. Belongingness went up in the MDMA group. Hidden self was a measure of authenticity. People reported more authenticity after MDMA-assisted therapy compared to the wait list. And they reported more self-compassion. So we have a bunch of more measures and at different time points that we're analyzing right now, but just some of the processes or the key processes we measured, they did move more in the MDMA-assisted therapy group. Okay, so how about what happened comparing the non-directive approach to this process-based approach? So this is the change in the LSAS scores, the primary outcome from pre to post. This is all 20 participants. And here you see what happens during the first 6. And remember, we were certified as competent by Lycos in doing this. And you see the mean during the first 6 cases was about 24. This is the dotted line. And then after we started doing the intervention with the more process-focused approach, we see the effect size go up for the mean being 53. And the overall difference was a G-score of 1. So this is a big improvement when we started using the more theory-based, evidence-based, targeted approach adapted to the condition and to the medication. So just to kind of review what it was that we did and kind of compare the two, on these different categories. With the non-directive approach, we're following the inner healing intelligence. In the process-based approach, we're doing a targeted intervention that's focused on particular processes. Non-directive approach, it has this minimal structure. And in the process-based approach, we have a flexible structure. It's not a session-by-session, do this, 1, 2, 3. It's flexible and responsive to the person, but it does have a structure to it. The integration for the non-directive approach tends to be eclectic. It allows tons of space for the therapist to do what they feel like is best in the MDMA, Lycos manual. We had SAD-specific exercises and homeworks that were part of the protocol. In the non-directive approach, we have this kind of more, I would say, at least this is my opinion, a more kind of general psychedelic, like this is the good kind of way to prep people for psychedelics. And in ours, we had a preparatory method that was really focused on, I didn't talk about that much, but we had a number of things we did that were really focused on how do you prep for MDMA, and specifically MDMA in the context of social anxiety disorder. So trying to optimize it for that context. In the non-directive approach, you allow any content to emerge. You're following the inner healing intelligence, and you go with what the client guides you. And in a process-based approach, you need to focus on the thing the person came for. They came here wanting their SAD treatment, and if their attention's really wandering into other places, you want to gently bring them back, and you want to use structures that help keep them focused on the core problem that they really want help with. And so we don't let the content go wherever. I mean, we're not like, no, you can't talk about that, but we have, kind of kind and gentle ways to redirect people, and the structure itself just keeps the focus there on their social relationships. So my experience of this is that both approaches, honor the MDMA experience, and the process-based approach adds these disorder-specific elements on top of that. Okay, so moving on to future research priorities. We are working towards a randomized controlled trial where we want to directly compare the more non-directive and this process-based approach in a way that's actually randomized. We're continuing to test and measure the psychological processes of change that are part of this. We have, as I said, we're analyzing the data, and we'll continue to do that in future studies. And then eventually move towards training protocols on how to apply this, and consider how might we apply a more process-based approach to other conditions as well. So what are some of the weaknesses here, or constraints? Well, this obviously was a small sample size, open label, has all the problems of open label, of course. It was a single site. There was a confound of time and experience with the changes, right? The smaller effect sizes were seen at the beginning, and then they went up later. At the same time, we were certified by MAPS as doing it competently, by them independently. So, that's definitely a confound. We need independent replication by a different group that perhaps has different allegiances. At the same time, I would say this provides some, proof of concept that a systematic psychotherapy approach, a development approach like we outlined, could enhance outcomes beyond a more kind of general, more supportive, non-directive approach. Yeah, my button wasn't working. All right, so some conclusions. I think this shows that this theory-based development process, it can work. And in our case, the evidence-based, more evidence-based, process-focused approach more than doubled the effect sizes of the intervention. So just to review, the argument here would be that psychedelic-assisted therapy, that this may apply generally, can be maximized through systematic observation of what's happening, theory-driven revision of the psychotherapy approach, and integration of evidence-based principles in a flexible way, into the psychedelic context, while maintaining respect for kind of how this kind of unpredictability and the mystery of what unfolds, as these substances are administered. So to me, one of the take-homes, a big take-home of this is that when we gave MDMA on its own without a well-articulated, focused, structured protocol, it didn't work that well. Our effect sizes were like CBT size. even with all the expectancy effects, right? People, it was unblinded, it was open protocol, so people came with massive expectancies, and we saw sizes that were like CBT. And it was really only when we started to use this optimized psychotherapy that people could more effectively utilize the drug state, benefit from the neuroplasticity to the extent that that's actually a thing, and take those peak experiences that they have during the MDMA state and make that relevant to their social anxiety and the struggles that they're having in social situations in everyday life. So my hope is that this provides a little boost towards more precision interventions down the road that match the psychotherapy more precisely to the conditions under study and to the specific medication or substance that we're administering, so that hopefully we get a synergy that results in the largest possible effects that we can have to help people who are hurting. So thank you. That is the end of my talk.